Welcome to the first season of aviation history on That Happened. In this special collection, you will find almost 60 minutes of weird and interesting aviation stories assembled for your binge watching or listening pleasure. So let's get right into it with episode 1, the 10 craziest ejection seats ever invented. While the concept of mechanically extracting pilots from a crashing airplane was proposed as early as 1916, it wasn't until the end of World War II that functional ejection seats began to be featured in operational aircraft. After the war, the ejection seat quickly became standard issue for most new fighter airframes. But not every escape system was able to make use of what one would call a typical ejection sequence. This is a list of some of the most unusual ejection and bailout methods that have ever been developed. While the introduction of jet aircraft was what created the growing need for reliable ejection systems, the resulting speed increase was also what ended up making early ejection seats incompatible with some airframes. The first seats were propelled by explosive charges similar to shotgun shells, which had enough force to get a pilot out of the cockpit, but often not to a height that would clear the rear of the airplane. One example of this is the F-104 Starfighter. The T-tail on this supersonic fighter was of particular concern during ejection, which engineers decided to solve by just going the other way. Yes, early versions of the F-104 featured a downward firing ejection seat, which was great for leaving the plane in a hurry, but not so great if you were already close to the ground. The Soviet Tu-22 bomber was another plane that required downward firing seats due to the two large engines mounted on the tail. These had a minimum height requirement of 1,000 feet. Any lower than that, and your seat would just make sure you were both dead and buried. Due to a large number of fatal landing accidents, crews nicknamed this aircraft the Man-Eater. While the introduction of rocket-propelled seats solved the tail strike problems, for some planes it was actually crew orientation that necessitated the use of alternate ejection methods. The B-47's navigator-bombarder position was located in the nose of the aircraft. So while the pilot and co-pilot would eject upwards, the only way for the third crew member to go was down. Today, there is only one remaining operational jet that still uses a downward ejection system. With 6 ejection seats, the B-52 Stratofortress has the most of any other aircraft. And due to its 2-story cockpit configuration, 2 of the 6 main crew stations are equipped with downward firing ejection seats. Now, just because ejection seats became more readily available after World War II doesn't mean every single new plane design was actually equipped with them. The Soviet swept-wing Tu-95 long-range bomber was put into service in the early 1950s. It had a top speed of 550 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 38,000 feet, a crew of 6, and no ejection seats. But that doesn't mean Russian engineers didn't take into account the challenge of multiple people trying to bail out of a large aircraft. With the understanding that the movement of a damaged or crashing plane can make physically reaching an exit almost impossible, the Tu-95 was equipped with a helpful feature: an evacuation conveyor belt. To exit the bomber, you just pull the emergency lever that jettisons the escape hatch, unbuckle your harness, roll out of your seat onto the now moving floor, grab onto one of the wooden slats on the conveyor, and ride your way out of the aircraft. And if you think only Russia would treat their aircrews like a piece of luggage, I'm here to assure you that there is at least one instance where the Americans didn't do much better. Developed for the US Navy in the early 50s, the Douglas A-3 Skywarrior had its ejection seats removed early in the design process. It's said this decision was based on the fact that no suitable system was available that could handle all 3 occupants in such close quarters. But the reasoning also came down to weight. At 70,000 pounds, this plane was the heaviest aircraft to ever operate from a carrier. Some lovingly called it the Whale, which is a refreshing change, as I find most nicknames seem to refer to a particular plane's tendency to crash or kill its crew. In place of ejection seats, Douglas did provide Whale aircrews with a well-engineered and reliable escape system, also known as a slide. Who knew that all that time as a kid at the playground was actually preparing you to one day bail out of a military aircraft? Pulling a handle in the cockpit will pneumatically blow out the inner and outer doors in the floor, forming a continuous chute. Each crewman would then have to maneuver out of their seat and jump feet first down the slide. Understandably, this escape system was pretty much useless at low altitude, making launch and traps on the carrier an even more hazardous operation. If something went wrong, you were forced to ride the plane in and hope all 3 occupants could get out the overhead hatch before the 70,000-pound plane sank below the waves. Thus, the A3D earned itself another nickname, All 3 Dead. See, I told you, aircraft nicknames, they're always so morbid. As ejection seat technology improved, there were requests from the Navy to retrofit the Sky Warrior with a more reliable escape system. But surprisingly, no changes were ever made, and the emergency slide remained in place until the plane's retirement in 1991. The B-58 Hustler was the U.S. Air Force's first operational supersonic bomber, capable of achieving speeds up to Mach 2 with a service ceiling of 70,000 feet. And I probably don't have to tell you that ejecting in such conditions would most likely be fatal. To overcome this unique challenge, a company called Stanley Aviation pioneered the fully enclosed individual escape capsule. By pulling a lever, the shoulder straps are tightened, legs are restrained, and an airtight shell is closed around the crew member and seat. On ejection, a drogue chute is used to stabilize and slow the capsule, at which point the main recovery parachute is deployed. A deceleration bag cushions the landings on hard surfaces, while outrigger booms and additional airbags keep the seat upright and afloat in water landings. Additionally, survival supplies and 72 hours worth of food were included to sustain the crew member until he could be rescued. While it would also be used in the XB-70 prototype, the B-58 remains the only production aircraft to feature individual crew escape capsules. But there were a few planes that took the capsule concept a step further. Soviet surface-to-air missile developments in the 1960s put a quick end to the United States' reliance on high-altitude bombers. Thus, the Air Force had new requirements for its next plane, which would need to be both supersonic and operate close to the ground. General Dynamics fulfilled these objectives with a swing-wing fighter plane that was equipped with terrain-following radar. The F-111 was designed to skim the ground at supersonic speeds well below enemy radar systems. But in the event of an emergency, the Air Force also wanted the crew to be able to eject under those same conditions. But this Mach 1 at 100 feet escape requirement wouldn't even be achievable by today's best seats, never mind ones in the 1960s. To overcome this challenge, the entire side-by-side 2-man crew compartment was turned into a 3,000-pound detachable capsule. After being separated from the plane with an explosive cord, 2 rockets take this literal escape pod up and away from the aircraft. Much like the individual capsules in the B-58, the F-111 crew version features deceleration bags for landing and was designed to float in water. Though such a system was proposed for other planes and even the space shuttle, the F-111 was the only production aircraft to ever be equipped with a full crew escape system, the only outlier being 3 of the cancelled B-1A prototypes, which featured a 4-man version. When the B-1 program was restarted in 1982, the B model used regular ejection seats to reduce weight and eliminate the extensive maintenance an escape capsule requires. Our next entry is probably the strangest escape system to ever be put into full production. This tractor rocket method is described as an extraction system rather than an ejection seat, because in this design, the seat doesn't actually leave the aircraft. Instead, a catapult-launched rocket is used to pull the pilot out of the cockpit via a tether. Once again, it's Stanley Aviation leading the way in unique egress engineering. They called it the Yankee Extraction System, a fitting name considering the fact that it literally yanks you out of the airplane. Designed to be used in cockpits with limited space for traditional ejection seats, it was implemented in 2 American warplanes, the Douglas A-1 Skyraider and the Fairchild AT-28 Nomad. Additionally, Russia employs their own version of the tractor rocket in the Ka-50 and Ka-52 helicopters, which pulls the pilots out of the cockpit after the rotor blades have been blown free. Despite looking like it is something out of a cartoon or spy movie, the Yankee system proved itself to be reliable, even in 0-0 situations, meaning it could get you clear of the airplane and high enough to open your chute at 0 airspeed and 0 altitude. After the Challenger disaster in 1986, NASA experimented with a tractor rocket escape system of their own. The space shuttle version required astronauts to lie on their backs one at a time to be launched out the side of the vehicle. Initial testing tore the legs off life-size dummies, and though results eventually improved, in the end, NASA decided it didn't like the idea of carrying rockets inside the space shuttle crew cabin. For our final section, we will look at some crazy bailout methods that were either designed for very specific situations or never made it much past the prototype phase. Like I mentioned earlier, the Challenger explosion really pushed NASA to try and develop some way for the crew to leave an aborted launch, even if it would only be usable in very specific conditions. Both the crew capsule and tractor rocket system were considered, but in the end, the answer ended up being a long, curved pole. Yes, these rocket scientists basically came up with something slightly better than a slide. It did the job though. Sliding down the telescoping pole on a tether allowed astronauts to exit cleanly and stay clear of the wings and tail of the shuttle. Over the years, there have been a few patents filed for commercial airplane escape systems, including one where each passenger has their own ejection seat, and another where the whole passenger compartment separates and floats to the ground suspended from multiple parachutes. In the early 70s, there were a few proposals for flyable ejection seats, allowing pilots to hopefully get clear of enemy territory and make rescue both easier and safer. And finally, we have this wild mechanical bailout concept from 1944. Before they became a world leader in ejection seat technology, one of Martin Baker's first designs was the swinging arm escape system. While it was never put to the test, the original model of this pilot trebuchet can be found at the Martin Baker offices. Episode 2. 5 unbelievable aircraft designs that look fake, but actually flew. AI-generated art has introduced us to a world with too many fingers, too many legs, and too much whatever the heck this is. And artificial intelligence often fares no better when it comes to rendering aircraft. But maybe we shouldn't be so judgmental with these types of errors. In today's video, we're going to look at 5 airplanes that look like bad AI, but instead are real designs that actually flew. And while I am giving a brief history for each of these entries, I will also be asking artificial intelligence to self-reflect on the apparent weaknesses of its own kind. Our first entry is the German BV-141. In 1937, the German Ministry of Aviation requested a new reconnaissance plane with a single engine and good all-around visibility for 3 crew members. To which the Blom & Voss company submitted a design that seems to have involved satisfying these 2 objectives separately and then just slapping them together. When the ministry turned down the radical proposal, Blom & Voss couldn't just stand by and let symmetry win. So they went ahead and financed the construction of a prototype themselves. Despite its appearance, the design was backed by real engineering and experience. Just as chief designer Dr. Richard Vogt had calculated and predicted, the crew gondola actually provided a perfect counterbalance for the engine and fuselage. The first flight of the plane in 1938 went well enough that the Luftwaffe became interested and ordered more prototypes. For its main role as a reconnaissance aircraft, the glazed gondola provided an unparalleled view of the battlefield below. Additionally, the plane had 2 forward-firing machine guns, 2 mobile defensive guns, and could carry 4 100-pound bombs. Though testing and design improvements would continue over the next couple years, the unbalanced-looking BV-141 would eventually lose out to the symmetrical, twin-boomed Focke-Wulf 189. In the end, between 15 and 20 BV-141s were produced, but unfortunately, none of these unique aircraft survive today. Next, we have the Caproni CA-60 Transaero, a plane that, according to ChatGPT, looks like someone overused the add wing button. Yes, after a successful run of heavy bombers during World War I, Italian designer Giovanni Caproni set his sights on the civilian aviation market and spammed that add wing button. The result was a 74-foot-long, 9-winged flying boat powered by 8 engines, 4 in the pull configuration and 4 set up as pushers. This ambitious long-range aircraft was intended to carry 100 passengers comfortably seated in wooden benches along panoramic windows. Meanwhile, the pilots were situated atop the fuselage in an open-air cockpit, because this was a time when you weren't a true airman unless your face was in direct contact with the atmosphere throughout the entire flight. Built over a period of just 18 months, taxiing tests on the CA-60 began in early February 1921. Its first flight followed shortly thereafter, and proved the precarious-looking beast was stable and maneuverable. Who could have predicted that just 18 years after the Wright Flyer, humans would be attaching wings to houseboats and dragging them off the water and into the sky. Unfortunately, the second flight on March 4, 1921, ended in disaster as a large boat crossed in front of the Transero during its takeoff run. As the pilot pulled up hard to climb over the obstacle, it is suspected that the unsecured sandbags meant to simulate passenger weight shifted within the fuselage, causing the aircraft to stall and tumble backwards into the water. Miraculously, the pilot and flight engineers survived unharmed, but Caproni's 9-wing Giant was a complete loss, never to be rebuilt, though some of the aircraft was salvaged and preserved and can be seen in person at the Caproni Museum in Italy. With a mix of design elements that feels like AI was told to merge jet fighter with vertical rocket, the Lockheed XF-V1 was part of a new aircraft design from the early 50s that were called tail sitters. The intention was to eliminate the need for runways, as these vertical takeoff fighters could be placed on the backs of ships or even spread out among high-value targets on the ground. In the event of a bomber attack, they would then quickly and easily be able to rise up and meet the enemy. The XFV Salmon was an extra peculiar example, since it had to be fastened with a temporary landing carriage. This allowed it to run test flights while waiting for an engine powerful enough to allow vertical takeoffs. It was an engine that would never arrive. Meanwhile, Lockheed's competitor, the lighter Corsair XYV1 Pogo, possessed a similar bad AI look, but did manage to demonstrate actual VTOL capabilities. Though controlling the aircraft during vertical flight proved to be especially challenging, and it quickly became evident that the technology was only going to be usable by the most experienced pilots. Additionally, by the mid-50s, conventional jet fighter performance had improved to the point that both the Salmon and the Pogo were considered obsolete. A turbojet version of the tailsitter was also explored, with the Ryan Aeronautical X-13 Vertijet taking flight in the second half of the 1950s. This was punctuated by a takeoff and landing demonstration at the Pentagon in April 1957, during which the pilot was able to expertly hang the aircraft back on the cable of its launching trailer. But the complexities of the technology, combined with the diminishing risk of heavy bomber attacks, eventually spelled the end of the vertical takeoff fighter program, and the Air Force and Navy directed their funding to more conventional aircraft. The Leduc 010 really does look like a poor AI attempt at creating a flying vehicle, especially since the need for a pilot seems to have been completely overlooked. But he's there, hidden away inside this flying tube. This plane featured a double-walled fuselage with the entire cockpit surrounded by the air intake, meaning that forward visibility was basically zero. The Leduc 010 was the world's first operational ramjet-powered aircraft, a propulsion system with virtually no moving parts besides the injection and ignition of the fuel. Designed by René Leduc, this French research aircraft was nearly complete before the German invasion required it to be evacuated from Paris in 1940. It was a move that saved it from German hands, but couldn't prevent its destruction later during an Allied bombing mission. Work was restarted after the war, and soon a new prototype was ready for testing. But due to a ramjet's inability to create thrust at zero airspeed, a mothership plane was required to carry the Leduc 10 up to the required velocity. Once launched, the pilot inside the flying tube was able to light the fuel and reach an impressive speed of 900 kilometers an hour, proving that ramjet-powered manned flight was actually possible. A larger version, the Leduc 021, followed in 1953. This design gave the pilot a much better vantage point, perched on the tip of the nose cone in a plexiglass bubble. The final iteration of the Leduc was 1956's O-22. Intended for combat use, the design was built to meet the French Air Force's specifications for a high-performance interceptor. The O-22 was fitted with a turbojet that allowed it to take off by itself, and managed to break through the sound barrier using the ramjet on December 1957. René Leduc was confident that this version of his plane was capable of Mach 2, but the flight testing contract was cancelled in 1958. For some reason, the Air Force was more interested in the Dassault Mirage 3. At the time of its first flight in 1933, the Soviet Kalinin K-7 was the largest land-based aircraft in the world. And honestly, everything about this plane seems to be hilariously oversized. from the giant pontoons that held the fixed landing gear to the 4,800 square foot elliptical wing that could accommodate cargo or passengers. As seen in this K-7 mock-up, the wing was 7 feet thick and capable of holding up to 120 people in its civilian configuration. For military purposes, the K-7 would have been a flying fortress almost 3 years before the first flight of the B-17. Along with 21,000 pounds of bombs, the plane was to be armed with 8 20mm autocannons and 8 machine guns. Of course, by the 1930s, aviation culture had advanced to the point that only the gunners were required to ride while hanging halfway out of the aircraft. The focus on making a plane large enough to hopefully impress the rest of the world meant the Soviet K-7 ended up underpowered and under-engineered. Its 7 engines only managed to get it up to a cruising speed of 180 kilometers an hour. Meanwhile, serious vibration issues plagued the plane. On its 8th test flight in November 1933, the structural failure of one of the tail booms of the only prototype caused a crash that killed 15 people and ended the project. I hope you enjoyed that list of old aircraft that look like they were designed by bad AI. If you found my content interesting so far, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future uploads. Not convinced I've earned that level of commitment? Well, let's see if episode 3 can change your mind, as we explore the 9 strangest things that have ever been dropped from an airplane. In 1995, Disney decided the world was ready for a family adventure comedy that took place during the Vietnam War. This movie tells the story of the American military's attempt to replace a village's elephant that had been killed by the Viet Cong, and the thrilling climax involves the parachute drop of said elephant from an airplane. According to the credits, it was inspired by a true story, and watching it with my son in 2024 got me thinking about what other weird or unbelievable things humans have purposely dropped from the air in the past. In the end, my research turned up some pretty interesting examples, which we'll get to in a minute. But it also showed me that the word inspired is the thing that was doing most of the heavy lifting in this movie. To be fair, in 1968, the airdrop of 2 elephants in Vietnam almost did happen. Unfortunately for us, word of the mission got out to the public, which created some understandable backlash with animal rights activists. Thus, the plan to parachute 2 elephants into a Vietnamese lumber operation was changed to instead be a helicopter lift, suspending the large animals on cushioned pallets for the final 65 miles of their journey into the jungle. Now, after both exposing the lie of the mediocre movie Operation Dumbo Drop and all but admitting the clickbait of my beautiful AI-assisted thumbnail, I believe I owe you guys footage of at least one large animal being dropped from the sky. So let's start our list with the incredible true story of the time the US Air Force used bears to test ejection seats. Entering service in 1960, the B-58 was designed to fly nuclear delivery missions at sustained supersonic speeds and an altitude of up to 70,000 feet, which was great for avoiding Soviet interceptors, but not ideal if you needed to leave the aircraft for any reason. To deal with this, a new escape capsule was developed that would protect each crew member during ejection, even at speeds up to Mach 2. Or so they hoped, because until you actually try it, there's really no way to know for sure. After rigorous ground testing, a subsonic ejection with a human in the capsule was conducted in February 1962. Chief Warrant Officer E.J. Murray's flawless test meant the B-58 escape capsule program was now ready to move on to supersonic trials. But the title for first successful supersonic ejection wouldn't be going to any human. Instead, a month after Murray's jump, it was a 2-year-old black bear named Yogi that was launched from the bomber at a height of 35,000 feet and a speed of Mach 1.2. After an 8-minute descent, Yogi landed unharmed in the desert outside Edwards Air Force Base. Testing continued for the next few months, involving several other bears and even a chimpanzee, with one ejection being conducted at twice the speed of sound. While there were some injuries to the animals, all of them survived their jumps. Unfortunately though, they were later euthanized in order to be studied for internal damages. In the end, the bear testing program was considered a success and led to some needed refinements before the entire B-58 fleet was fitted with the escape capsule system. After losing both his legs in a crash in 1931, a young Royal Air Force pilot named Douglas Bader found himself forced into retirement to despite demonstrating his abilities to still be able to pilot an aircraft competently with prosthetic legs. Later, as German aggression in Europe increased through the late 30s, Bader made several attempts to rejoin the RAF, finally being cleared as a fighter pilot again in November 1939. Through the Battle of Britain, Douglas Bader proved himself well, and by 1941 he was already heavily decorated, with 3 squadrons under his command and 20 confirmed aerial victories. On the 9th of August 1941, during a patrol over the French coast, Bader's Spitfire lost its tail in a suspected collision with a German Bf-109. After jettisoning his canopy, Bader's attempt to bail out was impaired by one of his prosthetic legs, trapping him halfway out of the cockpit. With time quickly running out, Douglas Bader deployed his parachute, which pulled him from the aircraft, but left his right leg behind. Later that day, a German wireless transmission confirmed Bader's capture, stating, "Wing Commander Douglas Bader taken prisoner on 9 August 1941. Lost his right leg while bailing out. Bader requests that a new leg be sent. German permission granted to drop it by parachute. Communicate day and time of delivery by radio. Delivering aircraft will be granted safe conduct." While the RAF was glad for the opportunity to deliver a new leg for its pilot, it was not going to give the Germans the positive publicity a safe passage would create. Instead, Operation Leg was combined with a bombing run on a power station nearby. The replacement prosthetic was packaged in a crate, attached to a parachute, and pushed out the escape hatch of a Blenheim bomber that was participating in the raid. A message was then sent to the enemy informing them of the drop, and the crate was soon retrieved by Luftwaffe personnel. Once Douglas Bader had 2 functioning legs again, he immediately used them for multiple escape attempts, becoming such an annoyance that he was eventually sent to Colditz Castle for the duration of the war. During the 1920s, the Curtiss Candy Company looked to capitalize on the relatively new and exciting emergence of powered flight by having special planes drop Baby Ruth bars and gum from the air. This rain of candy was advertised in the newspapers ahead of time, encouraging kids to watch for the falling treats hanging from rice paper parachutes. While it may seem like a harmless and ingenious advertisement, at least one town had a law against dropping items from planes, and Curtiss pilot Doug Davis ended up being fined $10 after landing his plane in Macon, Georgia. The Baby Ruth candy bombings also have an interesting connection to aviation history. In 1927, 12-year-old Paul Tibbets Jr. convinced his mom, Enola Gay Tibbets, to pay the $1 fee that allowed him to go up with Doug Davis and drop Baby Ruth candy to a crowd attending a race in Florida. This was Paul's first experience in an airplane, and encouraged an interest that would eventually lead to him becoming a pilot in the United States Army Air Corps. Paul would then take his place in history in August 1945 when he piloted the B-29 called Enola Gay to drop the first atomic bomb on Japan. When a funeral home in Dallas, Texas was asked to provide the best casket they had, they selected a 400-pound, $4,000 solid bronze model with white satin lining. By the time it arrived at the Parkland Memorial Hospital, President John F. Kennedy had been dead for less than an hour. To preserve the white interior of the casket, it was quickly lined with plastic, while the president's body was wrapped in linen sheets. Once inside the casket, the president was loaded into Air Force One and flown back to Washington. After arriving at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, it was found that the attempts to protect the casket from damage had been unsuccessful. Kennedy's wounds had been too great, seeping through the makeshift bandages. As a team worked to make the president presentable for the anticipated viewing at the Capitol, a new casket was brought in to replace the soiled bronze one. It was in this second hardwood casket that Kennedy would lie in state, with the lid closed at the First Lady's request. Then, on the 25th of November, the president was buried in the Arlington National Cemetery. For the next 2 years, the original Dallas casket was stored in a vault at the National Archives in Washington. Afraid it would fall into the hands of some morbid collector, the late president's brother, Robert, requested for the bronze coffin to be disposed of at sea. On February 19, 1966, a C-130 left Andrews Air Force Base with the casket aboard. 42 holes were drilled into it, and it was weighed down with 3 80-pound sandbags. Several miles off the coast of Delaware, President Kennedy's first casket was pushed out of the plane. 2 parachutes slowed its fall into the water, allowing it to land without breaking before sinking to a depth of 9,000 feet. Even though it has been a common practice in North America for over 60 years, to most people, seeing live fish drop from an airplane is both an unexpected and confusing sight. While it was not always well regulated or controlled, fish stocking itself dates back to the late 1800s, and in those early days it involved a lot of time and effort. The use of airplanes began in the 1940s, allowing large areas to be covered in minimal time. This old documentary shows trout being taken from hatcheries and dispersed among lakes in Quebec, Canada. And this 2021 video from Utah shows the same methods still in use today, though of course with better choices made about what types of fish, in what numbers, and what locations. Dropped at altitudes between 50 to 150 feet, survival rate for the fish is over 95%, and also the aerial dropping is actually said to be less stressful than the previous methods used to restock remote areas. In a nice contrast with the previous entry, our next weird aerial drop involves releasing one animal in order to kill another. The invasive brown tree snake was introduced to the Pacific island of Guam in the late 40s, most likely through US military transports after World War II. With no natural predator and prey that had never experienced a snake before, the population exploded rapidly. Out of the 18 bird species native to the island in 1950, 7 are now extinct. Brown tree snakes also like to crawl on electrical lines, causing regular power outages on the island. To combat the problem, the US government has turned to an unlikely hero, deployed in an unusual way: mice paratroopers. Laced with acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol, dead mice are now being regularly dropped by air all over the island. Streamers attached to the mice slow their fall and help them catch in trees where they are more likely to be found by the snakes. The small dose of painkillers is fatal for brown tree snakes and has been shown to be effective in the ongoing attempt to control the population. During World War II, restrictions on copper, iron, and brass meant the Steinway Piano Company focused most of its efforts on building troop transport gliders and coffins. But in 1942, it was decided the war effort did need pianos, and the Steinway Victory Vertical was designed to meet that unique challenge. Containing no more than 33 pounds of restricted metals, these relatively lightweight instruments were seen as a way to bring a morale boost to soldiers fighting all over the world. They came in 3 colors: olive, blue, and gray. And in many instances, the crated instruments were delivered by parachute dropped from B-17 bombers. Unfortunately, while we do have pictures of what the crated pianos looked like before delivery, no video or photographs seem to exist of a piano actually being dropped during the war. Around 500 glorified scarecrows were a key part of the Allies' D-Day operations. The English called them Ruperts, the Americans called them Oscars, and the Germans no doubt called them embarrassing, as the deception diverted several combat units away from the actual landing areas. Just 3 feet tall and made from cloth stuffed with hay and sand, the paratrooper dummies weren't very convincing up close. But from a distance, and when combined with noisemakers that simulated gunfire, it made for a very effective ruse, especially in the dark. In Payette Lake, Idaho, human expansion was starting to create issues with the local beaver population. Thus, in the fall of 1948, Fish and Game officials were given the task of relocating the animals to more rural areas. But since the proposed heavily forested locations had no roads, this meant a transplanting process that involved each beaver being trapped in a box and carried by a mule or horse. It was also a journey that could take multiple days, and one not all the beavers would survive. Thus, it was decided the more humane and cheaper method would be just to push the animals out of an airplane. Using surplus World War II parachutes and specially designed crates, 76 beavers were deployed to new locations in this fashion. The operation was a complete success, suffering only 1 casualty when a beaver managed to open its crate early and jump to its death, a move that no doubt only improved the gene pool of his species. As for the rest of the animals, when conservation officers checked on the relocated beavers a year later, they were found to be alive and healthy, having adapted well to their new homes. Next up in episode 4, we have the historical accounts of 5 severely damaged aircraft that defied the odds and kept flying. Boasting a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.17 to 1, the F-15 Eagle can not only maintain a vertical climb, it can accelerate while doing it. Such incredible power also gives this air superiority fighter another brag-worthy skill: the ability to fly with only 1 wing. In May 1983, the Israeli Air Force was conducting an air combat training session between 2 F-15s and 4 A-4 Skyhawks, when there was a mid-air collision between 2 of the aircraft. The A-4 pilot managed to safely eject as his plane came apart, while the 2-seat F-15 was thrown into an uncontrolled spinning dive. The Eagle crew was preparing to eject when the pilot decided to throttle up, which miraculously slowed the spin and brought the plane level again, giving them time to assess the damage and decide a course of action. Fuel was obviously leaking, confirmed by both the gauges and the plume of vapor that could be seen coming out the right side of the aircraft. But other than that, there were no warning lights indicating a problem. Yes, it seems F-15 manufacturer McDonnell Douglas had neglected to add a missing wing light to their cockpits. The nearest airfield was just 10 miles away, but for a reason still unknown to the crew, to maintain a steady flight path, this F-15 was being forced to come in at twice the recommended landing speed. The pilot lowered his arresting hook and called the tower to ask them to erect the safety net. Slowing before touchdown was not going to be an option. At a speed of 260 knots, the hook caught the arresting cable and was immediately ripped from the fuselage. But the pilot still managed to bring the plane to a stop 30 feet short of the emergency netting. At that point, the two men were finally able to see the extent of the damage. The leaking fuel had obscured both the crew and their wingmen from realizing the wing wasn't just damaged, it wasn't there at all. Later, the pilot would say that had he known the truth about his situation, he would have ejected immediately, adding that it's obvious you shouldn't keep trying to fly a plane with only one wing. When McDonnell Douglas first heard of the incident and saw the pictures, they thought it had to be a taxiing accident, or perhaps someone just trying to play a joke on them. But later, wind tunnel tests confirmed the claim. Due to the thrust and lift generated by the large body of the aircraft, flying an F-15 with one wing was actually possible, though only within a limited speed and angle of attack. And if you think about it, the math checks out. Losing a wing can only improve your thrust-to-weight ratio. During peacetime or civilian operations, an aircraft losing its vertical stabilizer is a rare occurrence, but also a fatal one. One example being the November 2001 American Airlines Flight 587 that lost its tail shortly after takeoff and plunged into a neighborhood of Queens, New York. But back in 1964, a B-52H Stratofortress suffered a similar structural failure with a surprisingly different result. In a weird twist of fate, the purpose of the B-52's flight on that day was to evaluate airframe stresses in specific low-level situations. Thus, the aircraft was crewed by Boeing test pilots and equipped with sensors recording aerodynamic loads on key surfaces. A few hours into the flight, while passing over the mountains of Colorado, the aircraft experienced 9 seconds of clear air turbulence. These gusts were later confirmed to be of a greater magnitude than had ever been previously recorded on any large aircraft. After the turbulence had passed, the plane continued to buck and roll, while the flight crew struggled with unresponsive rudder and elevator controls. No one really knew what the issue was, but abandoning the aircraft was looking to be the only option left. That is, until a transfer of fuel to the forward tanks and the deployment of the air brakes suddenly steadied their flight. Still unclear of the extent of the damage, the Boeing pilots called in chase planes to inspect the aircraft, and what they saw explained the rudder problems pretty well. 85% of the B-52's vertical stabilizer was missing, ripped from the fuselage due to the force of the turbulence. And yet somehow, the plane was still flying. Despite the extensive damage, it was decided that the B-52 would try to make it home. At the request of Boeing engineers on the ground, the rear landing gear was deployed, which immediately helped increase directional stability. Meanwhile, to make up for the lack of rudder, directional control was maintained by varying the throttles of the 8 turbofan engines. High winds at their home base in Wichita, Kansas meant the Stratofortress crew had to divert to Arkansas, extending their slow, tailless flight to over 5 hours. Fortunately, the Boeing test pilots were able to bring the aircraft and its valuable sensor data in for an uneventful landing at Blytheville Air Force Base. As a result, Boeing was able to use this information to explain the losses of previous aircraft and strengthen and improve the vertical stabilizers of its B-52 fleet. In 1988, Aloha Airlines was flying not one, but 2 of the most experienced 737s in the world. These island-hopping planes had accumulated almost 90,000 pressurization cycles, 15,000 more than was intended for the service life of the airframe. On April 28th, one of these 19-year-old 737s was on its 7th flight of the day and cruising at an altitude of 24,000 feet when disaster struck. Due to extreme metal fatigue, a failure along one of the joints in the fuselage opened a crack in the skin of the aircraft. Explosive decompression did the rest. As the pressurized air rushed out of the plane cabin through the hole, the massive force ripped the top off the first-class cabin, exposing 6 rows of seats and their occupants to the 400km/h jet stream. One stewardess, Carabelle Lansing, was immediately sucked out. But thankfully, everyone else had their seatbelts on and remained with the aircraft. Due to the loss of structural reinforcement, the cockpit had dropped more than 3 feet and snapped several floor beams. But amazingly, it still remained attached to the rest of the airframe. Captain Schornsteimer immediately began an emergency descent. The wind noise in the cockpit so extreme, they couldn't even talk to each other. Slowing down and leveling off at 10,000 feet reduced the noise and allowed the crew to call in their emergency. As they descended into Maui, the pilots were still unaware of just how damaged their plane really was. 35 square meters of fuselage was missing, and the wings and tail had been hammered by the wreckage. As well, both engines had ingested metal debris. And to add to that list, as they made their final approach, the left engine quit. Its throttle cable snapped by the buckling floor. But against all odds, Captain Schornsteimer and First Officer Tompkins were able to bring their crippled plane and its occupants safely back to the ground. Of the 95 on board, there were 64 people injured, 8 of them critically. But the only fatality was the unfortunate stewardess. All in all, an impressive and unexpected result for a commercial airplane that flew for 13 harrowing minutes, looking like this. Our next story is about a legendary bomber that both inspired a new emblem for its squadron and gave us one of the most famous photographs of World War II. On February 1st, 1943, the crew of the B-17F Flying Fortress, All-American, had dropped their bomb load on the Mediterranean seaports of Bizerta and Tunis, and were now turning to begin the 300-mile trip back to their base in Algeria. The planes of the 414th Bombardment Squadron had survived heavy flak on the way in, but on the way out, these unescorted bombers faced a new challenge: German fighter aircraft. 2 Me-109s began their head-on attack run against the lead B-17 and the All-American, which was flying next to it in the formation. The first enemy plane was quickly taken out by the concentrated fire of the bomber formation, while the second German fighter zeroed in on the All-American, its guns blazing. Just as the plane was about to pass over the B-17, one of the gunners scored a critical hit at the worst possible moment. The disabled plane was now unable to complete its roll away from the All-American, and instead collided with the large aircraft. Its wing cut through the rear of the plane like a knife, severing the left stabilizer and almost completely removing the entire tail section from the aircraft. Amazingly, none of the crew, including the tail gunner, were injured, and the plane was still flying. The other bombers closed in around the stricken plane, and it was at that moment a navigator in another B-17 snapped the famous shot. No doubt thinking to himself, this could be the last moments that the All-American was still all in one piece. But the plane miraculously held together for the entire flight home. During landing, the tail wheel wouldn't go down, but other than that, the touchdown was uneventful. Once on the ground, several more iconic pictures were taken of the damaged tail section, which finally broke free and fell off when ground personnel climbed aboard to inspect the plane. The story of this legendary B-17 flight would inspire a new emblem that was adopted for the 414th a year later. It showed a praying dog in the tail section of a similarly damaged plane. Meanwhile, the All-American was fitted with a new tail and continued to fly as a utility and transport aircraft until it was scrapped in March 1945. You can't make a video like this and neglect talking about one of the toughest single-engine fighters ever built, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The problem is, when a plane has the historic legacy of resilience like the P-47, which story do you pick? This was the type of aircraft where oil seemed optional, where groves of trees weren't worthy of being avoided during your strafing run, and where flak damage was just considered to be speed holes. My choice seemed like it was finally made when I came upon this incredible picture. But as I read through the details of the story attached to it, I started to have my doubts about the authenticity of the claims. And when further research turned up this undoctored version of the same image, I knew I had to look into this further before I included this tale in my video in good conscience. The good news is, after looking into the facts, I do believe this event did happen, but not in the way it has been told and retold in articles and videos over the years. So, I would now like to present to you the real story of a P-47 that flew home with half a wing. Amazingly, the pilot in this story is not one of the common exaggerations. Raimundo da Costa Canario was actually just 18 years and 8 months old when he arrived in Italy in January 1945, making him probably one of the youngest fighter pilots in the whole theater. Raimundo was part of a group of Brazilian aviation cadets that had been trained in the United States, which I was able to confirm through both military records and a memorial Facebook page that is specifically dedicated to his life and achievements. Once stationed in Italy, the Brazilian Air Force P-47s were tasked with fighter bomber missions, supporting Allied ground forces as they pushed into northern Italy, which is where we find Raimundo da Costa Canario about a month into his tour. Now, some retellings would have you believe this all began with Raimundo making 3 passes on enemy positions and taking out 3 German Tiger tanks in succession. To me, right away it seemed a little too specific and convenient to start this story with the destruction of 3 of the most recognizable pieces of the German war machine. And more reliable sources are on my side, describing the situation instead as an attack on armored vehicles without specifics or claims of successes. It is during one of these strafing runs that disaster strikes, and Raimundo's right wing clips a chimney. At such high speeds and low altitude, the result of such a strike would usually be abrupt and explosive. But amazingly, the P-47 keeps flying, though now with 1.2 meters or almost 4 feet of the plane's wing missing. From here, the story gets a little murky. One version has Raimundo being jumped by a few RAF Spitfires who mistake his now unusual profile for a German plane. As his radio is broken, he is unable to identify himself, and either gets shot up a bit before they realize their mistake, or he hits the throttle and outruns them on 1.5 wings, returning to his base in England, which is a surprising turn of events seeing that the Brazilian Air Force was operating in Italy. Raimundo da Costa Canario's 1997 obituary retells the wing loss story, but has no mention of any friendly fire. Instead, it does name his wingman, a Lieutenant Dornelis, who flew the B-4 plane. Allegedly, Dornelis flew by Raimundo's side all the way back to base, but as they made their approach, a message comes through Raimundo's apparently not broken radio. The P-47s are told to hold off on landing, as there is an American P-61 Black Widow in worse condition that has priority to land. Once again, to me this makes for a little too convenient ending to the story. The amusing thought of another plane being in worse condition than a P-47 missing half its wing. But in the end, I wasn't able to confirm or discredit this claim either way. When it comes to actual photographic proof, this picture here undeniably shows the A6 Brazilian P-47 missing a large portion of its right wing. But depending on where you find this picture online, the caption for it can vary. As for Lieutenant Raimundo da Costa Canario, to confirm the events happened, it's probably best to focus on him. According to military records, Raimundo completed 51 missions before the war ended, and he returned to Brazil. Based on the pictures I found on Facebook, he met up with his fellow Brazilian fighter pilots from time to time over the years. I was also able to find this painting from a few years before his 1997 passing that seems to corroborate this incredible story. You can see both B4 and A6 are featured in the picture. If the P-47 wing loss tale was exaggerated or fabricated, I would have expected to see it debunked during this time when both Raimundo and the members of his air group were still alive and people were literally making paintings of the event. Thus, personally, I have come to the conclusion that this amazing story did happen, just not in the way it often gets repeated these days. A6 and B4 both survived the war and were returned to Brazil, where they currently reside in a museum. This is a picture of some of Raimundo's descendants with the very plane he flew with half a wing. The caption reads, "If it weren't for the robustness of this P-47, 4 of those in this photo would not exist." Alright, we have made it to the final episode of the That Happened Season 1 Aviation Retrospective. I really appreciate you making it all the way to the end, and I hope you have found this collection both entertaining and educational. To finish off, Episode 5 will tell the unusual story of the Pepsi Concorde. Enjoy. While they had been in competition since the late 1800s, it wasn't until the second half of the 20th century that Pepsi finally started to make progress in the market share war with Coca-Cola. By way of the Pepsi Challenge taste tests of the 70s and big celebrity endorsement deals during the 80s, the company managed to capture a new generation of cola drinkers and cross the 30% threshold in 1990. But despite this rise, they found themselves still firmly stuck behind their arch rival. To the Pepsi company, it seemed like the only way to claim a true victory in the cola wars was to do something drastic. Which brings us to 1996 and Project Blue. This complete company rebrand introduced a new logo and packaging that provided a stark contrast to their main competitor's solid red design. Market research had convinced them that blue meant new, exciting, and refreshing. And to help usher in this new era, Pepsi was prepared to pull out all the stops, up to and including commissioning the world's first supersonic airliner. Even though the Concorde had been in service since 1976, in the 90s, this one-of-a-kind supersonic transport still represented power, ingenuity, and the future. Also, up until this point, the idea of using an airline as a mobile billboard was almost unheard of, thus making it sure to attract attention through both news media and word of mouth. Pepsi sent proposals to both Air France and British Airways, the only two airlines that operated the 14 Concordes in service. It's not known if Pepsi chose the cheapest option or the only one, but either way, it was Air France that was awarded the contract in early 1996. The plan was for Pepsi to use this plane to emphasize their new blue rebrand, but there was one big problem. The Concorde was only allowed to be white. Temperature is a very important consideration during supersonic flight, as even smooth and aerodynamic surfaces will heat up due to friction with the atmosphere. It is a well-known fact that darker colors build heat faster and retain heat longer than lighter ones. Thus, the plane was only certified for a white livery. Fortunately for Pepsi, after some consideration, the Concorde manufacturers were able to approve the blue fuselage. Only the wings were to remain white, to avoid heating up the fuel any more than necessary. But there was one other restriction that was given. While supersonic flight up to Mach 1.7 was deemed safe, Mach 2 would be limited to no more than 20 minutes at a time. Any longer, and that Pepsi blue paint could start melting. Not really the kind of story Air France or Pepsi wanted to be part of. With the temperature concerns now addressed, the Concorde, known by the call sign Sierra Delta, began its transformation at Air France's maintenance facilities in Paris. Through late March 1996, 2,000 man-hours were spent applying nearly 53 gallons of paint. This included the electric blue fuselage, the Pepsi branding on the white wings, and the red and blue globe logo on the tail of the aircraft. On March 31st, the Pepsi Concorde left Paris and flew to a hangar in London under strict secrecy. Meanwhile, on April 1st, acting on some covert intel, Richard Branson's Virgin Cola was able to preempt the new Pepsi rebrand with an April Fool's advertisement distributed throughout Britain. In it, Virgin Cola claimed that they had a new can that would react with cola and turn blue if the product was out of date. Thus, customers were advised to avoid all blue cans. On April 2nd, Project Blue was announced to the world. Journalists from 40 countries gathered at London's Gatwick Airport as tennis star Andre Agassi and supermodel Cindy Crawford introduced the new Project Blue commercial. The spectacle was said to have cost $5 million, making it the most expensive TV commercial ever made up until that point. Afterwards, through the flashing lights and fog, out rolled the Pepsi Concorde. The promotional campaign involved 15 flights over the next 7 days, with the Pepsi Concorde stopping at 10 different cities throughout Europe and the Middle East. Afterwards, it returned to Paris and had its original paint scheme restored. But Project Blue wasn't going to stop at just supersonic planes and supermodels.
So, as you know, there are not many territories left where the cola wars is not being fought. And you should really look at space as our latest battleground.
Yes, in May 1996, Pepsi filmed the first commercial in space. In a partnership with the cash-strapped Russian space agency, Pepsi paid to have a large aluminum and nylon Pepsi can flown to the Mir space station on a Progress spacecraft. Once there, footage was taken with the cosmonauts both inside and outside the orbiting complex. Allegedly, there was also a banner that was hung reading, "Even in space, Pepsi is changing the script," though I was unable to find any video proof of its existence. In the end, the commercial would never air. By the time it was ready, Pepsi had already altered the design of their new can, and it no longer matched the prop that was used on the space station. Pepsi's deal with the Russians cost somewhere in the range of $1 to $2 million. As mentioned before, the Agassi Crawford ad ran a $5 million price tag, while the Pepsi Concorde was at least a $200,000 paint job, never mind what Air France charged for the whole campaign. But these historic publicity stunts were just a small part of the $500 million that was spent to complete the worldwide Project Blue Pepsi rebrand. And the result? By the year 2000, Pepsi still had almost exactly the same market share that it had 10 years earlier. Yes, not even the power of an electric blue supersonic airliner was enough to move that line. But what Pepsi Concorde did manage to accomplish is kicking off a trend of passenger airliners being commissioned for product advertisements. And to finish off this video, I wanted to highlight some of the more unique sponsored liveries that have come along as a result. We'll start with this McDonnell Douglas from the Swiss airline Crossair, or should we call it a McDonald's Douglas? This special plane ran from 1996 to 2000 and included a ketchup red interior where passengers were served burgers and milkshakes, though it was decided that fries would not be cooked on board for obvious safety reasons. Japanese airline ANA is known for its unique themed liveries and travel experiences. This includes at least 10 separate aircraft that have been painted with special Pokemon designs since 1998. These often include Pokemon-themed seats, cabin crews, and merchandise. In 2015, ANA celebrated the release of The Force Awakens with Star Wars paint schemes. This included a Boeing 777 C-3PO and Boeing 787 R2-D2 and BB-8. When it comes to weird sponsorships, it seems there's no shortage of examples. From yogurt to razors. We seem to have reached a point where anything is worthy of aircraft advertising. Because sometimes you need a 737 to remind you that it's Shark Week. In my research, I also discovered that planes can wear headphones, watches, and even earmuffs and a scarf. Okay, that last one probably doesn't count. Going back 8 years before the Pepsi Concorde, one of the very first commissioned liveries ever was a partnership between SeaWorld and Southwest Airlines. Starting back in 1988, eventually 5 different airplanes carried the Shamu killer whale paint scheme. In addition, Penguin One was added to the fleet in 2013. But the 26-year-long relationship came to an end in 2014 due to public concerns about animal welfare and SeaWorld's checkered history. As we close out the video with some sponsored livery honorable mentions, I just wanted to thank you for watching and encourage you to subscribe to the That Happened channel for more unique aviation and space history. Additionally, I invite you to check out my Patreon link in the description for special behind-the-scenes content. My name is Sledge. Thanks for watching.